The dying sun bled crimson across the endless prairie grass as Eleonora Hartwell urged her team of mules toward the cottonwood grove that marked the river ford. The freighter wagon groaned beneath her weight, its iron-rimmed wheels finding every rut in the trail that stretched from Willow Springs toward the distant railroad depot at Copper Gulch. 6 months had passed since Arthur's burial, and still she could feel his presence riding beside her on the wagon seat, whispering warnings about the secrets locked away beneath the driver's bench. Her husband's Henry rifle lay across her knees, its walnut stock worn smooth by Arthur's calloused hands during 3 years of frontier life. The repeater had put meat on their table through harsh winters and drought-stricken summers, and now it might be all that stood between her and the vultures circling her land like buzzards over fresh carrion. The cottonwoods ahead promised shelter from prying eyes, but they also offered perfect concealment for anyone desperate enough to spill blood over water rights and buried secrets. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats made her blood turn to ice in her veins. "There she runs, boys." Greasy Pete Sullivan's voice carried across the evening air like the howl of a rabid coyote. "Widow woman thinks she can outrun Victor's justice with them stolen papers." Eleonora twisted on the wagon seat to see 3 riders closing fast, their horses lathered with white foam, and their faces twisted with the ugly anticipation of men who enjoyed their work far too much. Pete's scarred visage was unmistakable, even at distance a souvenir from a knife fight in Deadwood that had left him with a permanent leer and a taste for inflicting similar damage on others. The man was legendary throughout 3 territories, not just for his skill with weapons, but for his ability to track prey across impossible distances with the patience of a predator who savored the hunt more than the kill. Beside him rode silent Jack Morrison, whose bulk in the saddle made his horse strain with each stride, and Bear Claw Mackenzie, a bearded giant, whose reputation for violence preceded him across the frontier. All 3 wore the silver conchos that marked them as Victor Thorne's hired guns, and all 3 had their weapons drawn with the casual efficiency of professional killers. "Mabar, hiya, get up there." She cracked the leather reins across the mules' backs, feeling the team surge forward with surprising speed for animals that had already traveled 20 hard miles since dawn. The wagon bounced and lurched as they hit the rougher ground near the river, but the mules seemed to sense the urgency in her voice and the danger riding hard behind them. A rifle cracked and splinters exploded from the wagon's sideboards, inches from her shoulder. Another shot spanged off an iron tire rim, sending up a shower of orange sparks in the gathering dusk. The mules brayed in terror as bullets began to buzz around them like angry hornets, their ears laid back flat against their skulls as they fought between flight and panic. "Give it up, woman." Bear Claw's voice boomed over the gunfire like thunder rolling across the plains. "Victor just wants what belongs to him by right of law. Ain't no cause for you to die over some worthless papers." But Eleonora knew better. The contents of that tin box beneath her seat were anything but worthless. They were Arthur's final gift to justice, purchased with his blood and sealed with his murderer's name, written in legal documents that would see Victor Thorne hanged if they ever reached federal authorities in Copper Gulch. The cottonwoods loomed larger with each stride, their leaves rustling with the promise of shelter and the threat of ambush. But the distance seemed to stretch like taffy under the summer sun, while the sound of pursuit grew steadily louder behind her. Another shot cracked, and the near mule stumbled, dark blood streaming from a bullet graze along its neck. The animal tried to keep running despite its wound, but its legs folded like a broken chair, dragging its teammate down in a tangle of traces and leather harness. "Now you're afoot, missy." Pete's laughter had the ugly edge of a man who had found his calling in other people's suffering. "Victor's gonna be real pleased when we bring him that deed box and whatever other secrets you've been hiding." Eleonora scrambled to cut the traces with her skinning knife, freeing the surviving mule from its fallen teammate's dead weight. The animal was wild-eyed with terror and bleeding from several minor cuts, but it still had fight left in its powerful legs. She grabbed the lead rope and vaulted onto the mule's bare back, clutching the Henry rifle against her chest as bullets began to splash in the shallow water around them like deadly hail. That was when the willows exploded with violence more sudden than summer lightning. A Cheyenne warrior burst from the green tangle on a paint pony that seemed to dance across the broken ground, his long black hair streaming behind him like a war banner caught in the wind. He carried a Henry rifle identical to her own, and his first shot took down Pete's horse in a rolling crash of screaming animal and cursing man. The warrior's pony wheeled with fluid grace, and his second shot sent Silent Jack diving for cover behind a fallen cottonwood trunk. Bear Claw fired wild in response, his bullet creasing the warrior's ribs and drawing a bright line of blood across bronze skin. But the Cheyenne never flinched from the wound. Instead, he drove his pony straight at Eleonora's struggling mule, grabbing the lead rope with one powerful hand and pulling both animals deeper into the river as more shots kicked up fountains of muddy spray around them. "Hold tight." The warrior's voice was deep and steady as mountain stone, without a trace of fear, despite the blood running down his side and the bullets whistling past his head. "We make for the gravel bar." They crashed through cattails and shallow water, the mule's hooves striking sparks from the rocky bottom, while Eleonora clung to its mane with desperate strength. Behind them, the three gunmen had reached the riverbank, but they hesitated to follow into the treacherous footing of the ford, where quicksand and hidden holes could swallow horse and rider without warning. Instead, they spread out along the shore like wolves testing a wounded buffalo, with their rifles trained on the gravel bar where Eleonora and the warrior finally found solid ground. Water dripped from their clothes and weapons, while their animals stood with heaving flanks, grateful for solid footing after the terror of the chase. The Cheyenne swung down from his pony and stepped close to Eleonora, close enough that she could see the war paint on his sharp cheekbones and smell the wood smoke that clung to his hair like incense. His dark eyes held calculating intelligence as he studied the gunman across the water. And when he spoke, his voice carried clearly to every man within rifle range. "Your body is mine until I have my sons." The words hit Eleonora like a physical blow, but she saw the careful calculation behind the warrior's declaration. He was watching Pete and his companions, noting how they pulled back at his claim with the instinctive wariness of white men, who understood that territorial law became murky when it involved Indian marriage customs and federal treaties. Greasy Pete spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the muddy water and lowered his rifle with obvious reluctance. But there was something in his eyes, a gleam of satisfaction, that made Eleonora's skin crawl. "This ain't finished, breed," he called across the water with a grin that spoke of secrets and future plans. "Victor don't forget, and he sure as hell don't forgive. When he gets tired of playing games with territorial law, you'll find out what real justice looks like." As the three gunmen rode away, Pete looked back over his shoulder with that same unsettling smile, as if he knew something they didn't. Something that would make their temporary victory meaningless in the end. The town of Willow Springs crouched between rolling prairie and the granite shoulders of Raven's Nest, like a collection of weathered bones scattered by some ancient catastrophe. 24 buildings lined the single main street, most constructed from local timber and the kind of stubborn determination that kept frontier settlements alive despite drought outlaw raids and the casual brutality of men who measured their worth in cattle and water rights. Dr. Edwin Pike's office occupied the ground floor of the Cattleman's Hotel, its windows glowing yellow against the pre-dawn darkness like beacon fires in a hostile wilderness. At 45, Edwin carried invisible scars from battlefield surgery during the war between the states, along with the more obvious reminder of a Confederate saber that had carved a permanent limp into his left leg at Chancellorsville. His hands remained steady enough to dig bullets from wounded cowboys and deliver babies in sod-house kitchens, but they trembled when he thought about the choice he had made 6 months ago, a choice that haunted his dreams and made him question everything he thought he knew about courage and cowardice. The memory came back unbidden, as it always did in the hours before dawn. Victor Thorne's cultured voice, cutting through the darkness of his office, the glint of silver coins on his desk, and the quiet threat that had made Edwin's blood run cold. "You understand the delicate nature of our situation, Doctor. Arthur Hartwell's death was a tragedy, but tragedies become disasters when well-meaning people ask the wrong questions. I trust your official report will reflect the facts as they actually occurred." Edwin had known then that Arthur's skull fracture was inconsistent with a simple fall, had documented the evidence that pointed to murder. But Victor's casual mention of other doctors who had asked inconvenient questions, doctors who had suffered unfortunate accidents of their own, had convinced Edwin to write a second report, one that supported the official story of an industrial mishap. He had given Victor the false report and hidden the real one with Arthur's other papers, as his friend had requested. It was cowardice dressed up as pragmatism, and it ate at him like cancer. Across the street, schoolteacher Violet Morrison swept the front steps of her tiny classroom with mechanical precision, though her attention remained focused on the smoke signals rising from the direction of the river ford. At 30, she possessed the kind of quiet intelligence that made her valuable to a community starved for education, but also dangerous to men who preferred their women ignorant and compliant. The cottonwood ditch ran like a silver thread through the heart of Willow Springs, carrying precious water from the limestone spring on the Hartwell property to irrigate the hayfields and kitchen gardens that sustained life in this harsh country. Arthur Hartwell had surveyed and dug that channel with his own hands, using instruments borrowed from the Territorial Surveyor's Office and engineering knowledge gleaned from his father's textbooks. But Arthur was 6 months dead, killed in what Sheriff Klaus Muller had ruled a tragic accident at the Quicksilver Ridge Quarry. County Clerk Oscar Brennan claimed to possess documents proving that Arthur had sold his precious water rights to Victor just 2 days before his death. Only Eleonora knew the truth about those forged papers, and only she possessed the evidence that could bring Victor's empire crashing down. Sheriff Klaus Muller wore Victor's corruption like a badge of honor, his allegiance purchased with regular payments that far exceeded his official salary. The German immigrant had served as a sergeant in the Union Army, until Gettysburg taught him that survival mattered more than honor or principle. When Victor had offered him a choice between cooperation and a shallow grave in the desert, Klaus had made the pragmatic decision. Deep in the Raven's Nest Hills, the Ghost Creek mine operated in violation of every federal law governing Indian Territory and child labor practices. Greasy Pete Sullivan supervised the operation with methodical cruelty, but what made him truly dangerous was his intelligence. Pete didn't just brutalize the children he studied, them learned their weaknesses, and used psychological torture as efficiently as physical pain. He had turned the mining operation into a laboratory for breaking human spirits. Among those stolen children, 2 Cheyenne boys struggled to survive in underground darkness. Talon, aged 10, bore the pronounced limp from when Pete had methodically broken his ankle as a lesson to the other children about the cost of defiance. His younger brother Yaji, only 8 years old, still wore the red scarf their grandmother had woven, though Pete allowed it only because he knew it made the boy a target for other prisoners' resentment. Wakiza himself maintained a careful vigil from the wilderness surrounding Willow Springs. The Cheyenne warrior had tracked the slavers across 300 miles of prairie and badlands, but Pete's reputation for cunning had proven well-deserved. Twice now, Wakiza had found signs that Pete was aware of his pursuit, broken branches arranged in patterns that mocked Cheyenne trail markers, deliberately abandoned campsites positioned where Wakiza would find them, but learned nothing useful. The claim words Wakiza had used at the river ford were calculated to exploit white fears about Indian marriage customs and federal law. By claiming Eleonora according to what whites imagined were Cheyenne traditions, he had created legal complications that Victor's hired guns preferred to avoid. But it was a temporary protection at best. Dawn broke gray and cold across the prairie when Eleonora and Wakiza approached Willow Springs from the north, their horses moving with the measured pace of animals that had traveled hard through dangerous country. The weight of Arthur's evidence pressed against her spine beneath her heavy woolen coat, but it was nothing compared to the weight of responsibility she carried. During their night ride from the river ford, she had learned more about her unlikely ally. Wakiza spoke in careful economical phrases that suggested English was not his first language, but his intelligence was obvious in everything from his tactical awareness to the way he read the country around them. "My sons," he had said simply when she asked about his quest. "Taken by men with pale eyes and silver coins. Taken to dig death from stone while their spirits break like winter branches." The poetry in his words, even constrained by unfamiliar grammar, spoke of a man who thought in metaphors his own language could express, but English could only approximate. Now, as they rode toward the town where Arthur had lived and died, Eleonora felt the familiar mixture of grief and rage that had sustained her through 6 months of careful planning. But watching Wakiza's quiet intensity as he scanned the approaches for danger, she realized her quest for justice had become something larger than personal vengeance. Sheriff Klaus Muller emerged from his office as they approached the courthouse, his pale eyes fixing on the Cheyenne warrior with calculating interest. The German's hand rested casually on the grip of his Colt peacemaker, but his expression showed more curiosity than immediate hostility. "Well, well," Klaus drawled in his thick accent. "The widow woman returns from her evening ride. Heard tell you had some excitement out by the river ford yesterday." "Nothing I couldn't handle." Eleonora replied evenly, though her own hand moved instinctively closer to the rifle balanced across her saddle pommel. "Seems like Victor's boys need more practice with their shooting." Klaus's smile held all the warmth of a winter wind. "Funny thing about that. Got reports of a white woman consorting with a heathen warrior in violation of territorial law and Christian decency. Might be I need to place you under protective custody while we sort out the facts." Before she could respond, and the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention toward the southern end of town. Victor Thorne rode up the main street with 6 armed men behind him, their horses fresh and their weapons prominently displayed. The cattle baron himself presented an image of civilized authority in his tailored eastern coat and silver-trimmed hat. But Eleonora could see the cold calculation in his eyes. Dr. Edwin Pike chose that moment to emerge from his office, his medical bag in one hand and a Winchester rifle in the other. But there was something different about his demeanor, a nervous energy that made Eleonora wonder if the good doctor was entirely trustworthy. "Morning, Mrs. Hartwell," Edwin said with forced cheerfulness. "Heard you might be planning a journey to Copper Gulch. Wondered if you might appreciate some company on such a dangerous trail." Wakiza studied Edwin with the intensity of a hunter evaluating prey, and Eleonora caught the subtle tension in the warrior's posture. Whatever Wakiza saw in the doctor's manner, it had triggered his instincts for danger. "That's very thoughtful, Dr. Pike," she replied, carefully conscious that every word was being weighed by multiple listeners. "But I wouldn't want to impose on your valuable time." "No imposition at all," Edwin assured her, but his eyes flickered nervously between her face and the tin box she carried. There was guilt there, and fear, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Greasy Pete Sullivan spurred his horse forward from Victor's group, his scarred face twisted into that unsettling grin. "Seems to me this conversation's gone on long enough," he drawled. "Time for decent folks to move along and leave law enforcement to them as gets paid for it." Walter Kowalski chose that moment to arrive with his buckboard loaded with farming implements and grain sacks. The Polish immigrant's timing provided additional witnesses to an already complicated situation, but Eleonora noticed how Edwin's face went pale when Walter appeared. "Good morning, neighbors," Walter called cheerfully. "Beautiful day for traveling, is it not? Perfect weather for visiting friends in distant places." The subtext was clear. Walter was offering support for her mission. But as the various factions positioned themselves on the main street of Willow Springs, Eleonora felt an increasing sense that forces were moving beyond her control, and that not everyone claiming to be her ally could be trusted. The moon hung like a silver dollar above the prairie. When Eleonora, Wakiza, and Edwin finally made their escape from Willow Springs under cover of darkness, Walter had provided fresh horses and supplies, but as they rode through the cottonwood groves toward Shadow Lake, Eleonora found herself studying Edwin Pike with growing suspicion. The doctor rode with the stiff posture of a man carrying guilty secrets, and more than once she had caught him staring at the tin box with an expression she couldn't quite read. When Wakiza dropped back to ride beside her, his concerns confirmed her own growing doubts. "The white medicine man speaks with forked tongue," Wakiza said quietly, his English fractured, but his meaning clear. "Eyes hold shame secrets. Heart beats like rabbit in trap. You don't trust him either," Eleonora replied, keeping her voice low enough that Edwin couldn't overhear their conversation. "Trust is earned with blood and time," Wakiza replied. "This man has given neither." Shadow Lake spread before them like a dark mirror reflecting the stars, but the causeway crossing proved even more treacherous than Walter had warned. The footing was soft and uncertain, and they had barely reached the halfway point when Sheriff Klaus Müller rose from concealment with 2 deputies flanking him. "And that's far enough." Klaus shouted, his rifle trained on Edwin's chest. "Drop them weapons and step away from the horses." The trap had been sprung with devastating efficiency. But what happened next confirmed Eleonora's worst suspicions about their traveling companion. Instead of showing surprise at the ambush, Edwin's face showed something closer to relief, as if a burden he had been carrying was finally lifted from his shoulders. "I'm sorry," Edwin called out, his voice cracking with emotion. "I never wanted it to come to this, but Victor gave me no choice. He has ways of making people cooperate." The betrayal hit Eleonora like a physical blow, but Wakiza was already moving his rifle, speaking as he fired a warning shot over Klaus's head. The sudden violence spooked the horses and created the chaos they needed to escape into the cattails. But Edwin's revelation had shattered what little trust existed between them. As they fought their way through the black water with bullets splashing around them, Eleonora found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about Arthur's death and the people she had trusted to help her seek justice. It wasn't until they reached the mudflats on the far shore that Edwin explained himself, his voice heavy with shame and self-loathing. "Victor came to me after Arthur died," he said, water streaming from his clothes as they took shelter among the cottonwoods. "He offered me a choice: write the report he wanted or suffer the same accident that claimed your husband. I was a coward, Mrs. Hartwell. I chose to live." "But you kept the real report," Eleonora said, understanding beginning to dawn. "You hid it with Arthur's other papers. Arthur asked me to examine his body if anything happened to him. I found evidence of murder, documented it properly. But when Victor threatened me," Edwin's voice trailed off, "I wrote a second report, one that supported the accidental death story. I gave that to Victor and hid the real one where he'd never think to look for it." Wakiza studied the doctor with dark eyes that revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Why you come with us now? Why not stay safe in Victor's shadow?" Edwin met his gaze steadily. "Because I've been dying a little each day for 6 months, knowing I let Arthur's killer walk free. Because some things matter more than staying alive." He paused, then added quietly, "And because Klaus was supposed to kill all 3 of us at that crossing, Victor's tired of playing games." The revelation that they had all been marked for death changed the dynamic between them, but it didn't immediately restore trust. As they made their way through the wilderness toward Raven's Nest, country Eleonora found herself watching Edwin for any sign that his supposed redemption might be another layer of deception. The timberline cut sliced through the granite backbone of Raven's Nest like an ancient wound, its narrow passage barely wide enough for 2 horses to travel side by side. But what made their journey through the defile truly harrowing was the evidence they found that Greasy Pete was not simply following them. He was orchestrating their movements like a chess master positioning pieces for checkmate. At the first water stop, Wakiza found Pete's calling card, a carefully arranged pile of stones in the shape of a Cheyenne burial marker. The message was clear and personal. Pete knew exactly who was pursuing him, and he was confident enough to mock Wakiza's cultural symbols. He plays with us," Wakiza said grimly, studying the deliberate arrangement. "Like cat with mouse before killing bite." The psychological warfare continued throughout their climb toward the high passes. They would find abandoned campsites positioned where Pete knew they would discover them always, with some small detail that revealed he had been watching their approach. A coffee cup still warm to the touch. Horse droppings arranged in patterns that spelled out crude insults. Most disturbing of all, child-sized handprints pressed into mud near a stream, evidence that Pete was moving the kidnapped children ahead of them, using the captives as both shield and bait. It was Edwin who finally understood Pete's true strategy. "He's not trying to escape us," the doctor realized as they studied Pete's latest message arrows carved into tree bark, pointing in 3 different directions. "He's herding us towards something. Probably an ambush where he has every advantage." Wakiza nodded slowly. Greasy Pete learns from Cheyenne war tactics. Make enemy believe they choose path while warrior controls all roads. Their suspicions proved correct when they crested a ridge and spotted the Ghost Creek mining operation in the canyon below. The placement was tactically perfect. Anyone approaching would be silhouetted against the skyline, while the mine itself was positioned in a natural fortress of stone that would be nearly impossible to assault directly. But what they saw through Edwin's field glasses made Eleonora's blood run cold. The children laboring in the mine weren't just working, they were performing for an audience. Pete stood on a platform overlooking the operation, and beside him was a figure that made Wakiza intake sharply. Talon. The warrior breathed, recognizing his older son despite the months of captivity and abuse. The boy was standing next to Pete, but his posture was wrong, too rigid, too careful. Then Eleonora saw the chain around the child's ankle and understood Pete's newest cruelty. "He's using your son as a human shield," she whispered. "The chain is just long enough to let the boy move around the platform, but not long enough to escape. Anyone trying to shoot Pete risks hitting Talon." Edwin lowered his glasses with shaking hands. "That's not the worst of it," he said quietly. "Look at the other children. See how they keep glancing up at the platform. Pete's made it clear that any rescue attempt will result in Talon's death. He's turned the boy into insurance against his own people." The psychological dimension of Pete's cruelty was more sophisticated than simple physical brutality. He had studied his prisoners, learned their relationships and loyalties, then weaponized their love for each other. The other children worked with desperate efficiency, not because they feared for their own lives, but because they had been conditioned to believe that any mistake on their part would result in Talon's suffering. "We need a different approach," Eleonora said, her strategic mind already working on the problem. "Direct assault won't work, but Pete's confidence might be his weakness. He's so certain he controls the situation that he might not be prepared for something completely unexpected." That night, they attempted their reconnaissance of the mining operation, but Pete had prepared for that as well. They had barely approached the perimeter when bells began ringing throughout the complex, not alarm bells, but a rhythmic pattern that sounded almost like celebration. "We welcome visitors." Pete's voice boomed across the canyon, amplified by the natural acoustics of the stone walls. "Been expecting you for some time now. Hope you enjoyed the little trail markers I left for you." Lights blazed throughout the mining operation, revealing that Pete had positioned guards at every approach. But more disturbing was the sight of children being herded into the open areas where they could serve as human shields. Pete had turned the entire complex into a fortress where any attack would inevitably result in civilian casualties. "Your boy Talon wants to say hello to his daddy." Pete continued, his voice dripping with mock courtesy. Through the field glasses, they could see him forcing Talon forward to the edge of the platform. The boy's face was pale but defiant, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the canyon. "Mum, father," Talon called out in Cheyenne, his words chosen carefully. "The snake has many holes, but his heart beats in only one place. When the eagle strikes, it does not aim for the tail." Wakiza went rigid as he translated his son's message. The boy was telling him that Pete moved between different locations throughout the complex, but always returned to one central position. More importantly, Talon was giving them intelligence about the layout and security measures disguised as the rambling of a frightened child. "Smart boy you got there." Pete's voice carried a note of genuine appreciation. Almost too smart for his own good. But then, intelligence runs in families, don't it? Just like stupidity. Your Arthur was real intelligent too, Mrs. Hartwell. Right up until the moment Victor caved his skull in. The casual mention of Arthur's murder was designed to provoke an emotional response. But it also revealed something important. Pete knew exactly who they were and why they were there. This wasn't a chance encounter or a simple pursuit. It was the culmination of a plan that had been set in motion months ago. As they retreated from their failed reconnaissance, Eleonora found herself reassessing everything she thought she knew about their situation. Pete's psychological games weren't just cruel entertainment. They were part of a larger strategy designed to break their spirits before the final confrontation. But Talon's coded message had also given them hope. If a 10-year-old boy could find ways to resist Pete's control and communicate vital intelligence, then perhaps their enemy wasn't as invincible as he wanted them to believe. The abandoned line shack squatted against the granite outcropping like a wounded animal seeking shelter from the relentless mountain wind. Inside the dilapidated structure, Eleonora finally opened Arthur's tin box, with hands that trembled from more than just the cold. What she found inside would change everything about their mission and reveal the true scope of Victor Thorne's criminal empire. The original preemption deed to the Willow Springs water rights was there, perfectly preserved despite their harrowing journey. But beneath the expected legal documents lay evidence of crimes that went far beyond simple fraud and corruption. A folded receipt bearing Victor Thorne's signature authorized payment for slate removal services during the exact week that Arthur had died. The amount listed was far more than any legitimate quarrying operation would require, and the timing made the document's meaning unmistakably clear. "What exactly is slate removal?" Edwin asked, reading over her shoulder with growing horror. "A mining term." Wakiza replied quietly. "Clear loose rock from tunnel walls before cave-in kills workers. Dangerous work accidents happen easy when someone wants them to happen." But it was Edwin's own medical report that provided the most damning evidence. Hidden among Arthur's papers was the original examination document written in the doctor's careful script and dated 3 days before Arthur's death. "Skull fracture inconsistent with reported fall," Edwin had written. "Pattern of damage suggests deliberate blow from heavy implement, possibly mining pick. Recommend immediate consultation with Territorial Marshal regarding suspicious circumstances." Eleonora stared at the report, then at Edwin himself. "You documented the murder from the beginning," she said slowly. "You knew Arthur was killed, but you let Victor's version stand as official record." Edwin's face crumpled with shame. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Victor made it clear that asking questions about Arthur's death would be hazardous to my health. So I wrote 2 reports, the real one, which I hid with Arthur's papers, as he had asked me to do, and a false one that I gave to Victor to buy my safety." The revelation explained Edwin's nervous behavior and his decision to join their mission. He wasn't just helping them seek justice, he was trying to atone for his own cowardice. But the most shocking discovery came at the bottom of the tin box. Wrapped in a separate piece of oiled cloth were 2 braided hair ties and a circular piece of beadwork showing distinctive Cheyenne patterns. Personal possessions that could only have belonged to kidnapped children. Wakiza's reaction was immediate and visceral. Talon and Yaji. He breathed, reaching toward the items with trembling fingers. My boys wore these when the slavers took them. Arthur's explanatory note, dated 1 week before his death, revealed how he had found the items near the river while checking his boundary markers. He had recognized them as belonging to Indian children and planned to include them in his report to federal authorities as evidence of systematic kidnapping. Your Arthur died trying to save children he never met, Wakiza said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He was true warrior fighting evil, even when it meant his death. The full scope of Victor's criminal empire was now clear. The cattle baron hadn't simply stolen water rights, he had built his entire operation on murder, kidnapping, and slave labor. The missing Cheyenne children provided unpaid workers for illegal mines, while their forced labor generated the capital needed to expand his influence throughout the territory. As they prepared to leave the line shack, Edwin made a confession that completed their understanding of the conspiracy they faced. There's something else you need to know, he said reluctantly. Victor didn't just threaten me about writing false reports. He also asked me to keep him informed about any visitors Mrs. Hartwell might receive, any plans she might be making. You've been spying on me. Eleonora said, the betrayal cutting deep despite everything else they had learned. I gave him useless information, things he could have learned from anyone in town. But he thinks I'm still his informant. Edwin met her gaze steadily. That might be useful when we reach his ranch. He won't expect treachery from someone he believes he still controls. The revelation added another layer of complexity to their situation, but it also provided a potential advantage. If Victor still trusted Edwin, the doctor might be able to get close enough to do some real damage when the time came for their final confrontation. Dawn came gray and merciless to the high country, bringing with it the sound of approaching hoofbeats that announced Pete's final pursuit. The gunfighter had tired of his psychological games and was now closing in for the kill with the methodical efficiency of a professional hunter. Ikah. They come like wolf pack, Wakiza observed, studying the dust clouds rising from multiple directions. Pete learns from failure at Canyon. Now he brings enough guns to finish what he started. Edwin struggled to his feet, favoring his wounded leg while checking his Winchester. How many? Too many, Wakiza replied grimly. But numbers mean little in country like this if you know where to look for advantages. They saddled their horses in pre-dawn darkness. But before they could escape, Walter Kowalski appeared at the entrance to their hideout. The Polish farmer was driving his freight wagon at breakneck speed, his face pale with urgency and fear. They burned my farm, Walter gasped, pulling his team to a halt. Victor's men came in the night, said it was payment for helping enemies of the territory. But even as Walter spoke, Pete's rifle cracked from the rocks above them, and the farmer pitched forward with dark blood spreading across his back. The man who had survived famine and immigration died with his hands still holding the reins that had carried him into this final act of defiance. No. Eleonora started toward the fallen farmer, but Wakiza caught her arm. He chose his death like warrior, the Cheyenne said grimly. Honor him by living to finish what he died for. They took refuge in a root cellar hidden beneath the line shack's foundation, crawling through narrow tunnels while Pete's men searched above them. The underground passage led to a dry wash where their horses waited. But Edwin was struggling with more than just confined spaces and poor visibility. The doctor had taken a bullet during Pete's opening volley, and blood seeped steadily through his shirt despite their makeshift bandaging. I can ride, he insisted through gritted teeth. But not for long without proper medical attention. They emerged from the tunnel system to find Pete had anticipated their escape route. The gunfighter stood on a rocky outcrop above the wash, his rifle trained on their position, while his men moved to surround them. "End of the trail," Pete called out with satisfaction. "Victor's getting tired of this cat-and-mouse game. Time to bring you all home for a proper conversation about them papers you've been carrying." But Pete had made one critical error in his positioning. The outcrop where he stood was directly below a slope of loose shale that had been destabilized by recent rains. Eleonora saw the opportunity and took it, putting a carefully aimed shot into the key support stone that held the entire slope in place. The avalanche that followed was small but devastating, sending Pete tumbling down the rocky slope in a cloud of dust and debris. He survived the fall, but his rifle was smashed and his men were scattered by the cascade of stone. "That's for Walter," Eleonora said grimly as they spurred their horses up the wash toward higher ground. The storm that struck Raven's Nest came with all the fury of nature unleashed, turning the mountain trails into torrents of mud and stone. Lightning split the black sky while thunder rolled through the canyons. But the weather that threatened to kill them also provided the concealment they needed for their final assault on Victor Thorne's stronghold. Wakiza's sister Ayasha had found them just hours before the storm struck, emerging from the wilderness, with 3 Cheyenne warriors and news that changed everything about their tactical situation. "Takala scouts the mine," she reported in careful English. "Guards grow careless in storm. Children can be taken when lightning blinds sentries." The plan they developed was audacious in its simplicity. While Wakiza and his relatives created chaos by attacking Victor's ranch and scattering his horse herd, a separate team would infiltrate the mining operation and extract the kidnapped children during the confusion. Edwin's role was crucial. His supposed loyalty to Victor would get him close to the ranch house where the evidence was kept. But it also meant walking into the lion's den with no guarantee of support if his deception was discovered. "You sure about this, Doc?" Eleonora asked as they prepared for the assault. "Victor's no fool. If he suspects you're playing both sides, then I'll die knowing I finally did the right thing." Edwin replied simply. "That's more peace than I've had in 6 months." The first phase of their assault unfolded with deadly precision. Wakiza slipped through the corral rails and cut the horses loose, sending 20 animals thundering past the bunkhouse in chaos that brought Victor's men running from shelter. The gunfight that erupted was savage and brief, with Cheyenne warriors using the storm's fury to mask their movements and strike from unexpected angles. Eleonora approached the ranch house disguised as one of the Mexican women who worked for Victor's operation. But her plan went wrong almost immediately. Greasy Pete was waiting in the kitchen, his scarred face twisted into a grin of anticipation. "I wondered when you'd show up," Pete said conversationally, his hand resting on his gun. "Victor figured you'd try something like this. Question is, are you brave enough or stupid enough to see it through?" The fight that followed was desperate and brutal. Pete was faster with his weapons, but Eleonora had the advantage of fighting in familiar surroundings. She had helped Mexican women with their work often enough to know every pot pan and cooking implement in the kitchen. She threw boiling water from the stove, stunning Pete long enough to grab a butcher knife. When he recovered and drew his gun, she overturned the heavy wooden table to create cover, then used the kitchen's narrow confines to prevent him from getting a clear shot. "You got more fight than your husband," Pete taunted as they circled each other in the confined space. "Arthur went down with one good crack to the skull. Didn't even see it coming." The casual cruelty of his words fueled Eleonora's rage, but she forced herself to stay focused. Pete was trying to provoke her into making mistakes, just as he had done with the psychological games during their pursuit. When Pete finally rushed her, she was ready. The butcher knife caught him just below the ribs, but not deeply enough to stop him. He backhanded her across the face, sending her sprawling, but she rolled under the table and came up behind him with a cast-iron skillet that caught him squarely across the back of his skull. Pete went down hard, blood streaming from his scalp, but he wasn't finished. As Eleonora ran for the stairs leading to Victor's office, she could hear him behind her cursing and stumbling, but still in pursuit. Victor Thorne's office was a monument to civilized barbarism, polished mahogany furniture, leather-bound books, and oil paintings that depicted scenes of pastoral tranquility. But the man himself, standing behind his massive desk, with Arthur's tin box open before him, represented the kind of evil that civilization's veneer was designed to conceal. "Mrs. Eleonora Hartwell," Victor said with cultured politeness, as if greeting a guest at a social function. "I've been expecting you. Please come in and close the door behind you. We have so much to discuss." The cattle baron was a man in his early 50s with silver hair and the kind of refined features that spoke of Eastern breeding and expensive education. His suit was tailored, his boots polished, and his manner suggested someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who had learned to use civilization's tools for savage purposes. "I believe this belongs to you," he continued, gesturing to the tin box. "Your late husband's collection of documents and personal effects. Quite fascinating reading, actually." Arthur was a thorough man, methodical in his record-keeping. Unfortunately, he was also naive about the realities of territorial politics. Eleonora entered the room with her hand resting on the grip of her revolver, but Victor seemed unconcerned by the implicit threat. Instead, he moved around the desk with the fluid confidence of a man who believed he controlled every aspect of their confrontation. "You're wondering why I'm not afraid of that gun," Victor observed with amusement. "The answer is simple. You're not a killer, Mrs. Hartwell. You're a woman of principle raised to believe in law and justice and the fundamental decency of human nature. Those beliefs make you predictable, and predictability is a weakness I've learned to exploit. You murdered my husband." Eleonora said, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her chest. "You stole his land, corrupted the officials who were supposed to protect him. And when he discovered your crimes, you had him killed like a rabid dog." Victor nodded approvingly, as if she had passed some kind of test. "Exactly right. Arthur discovered my mining operations and the labor force that makes them profitable. He documented everything with the obsessive thoroughness that made him such an excellent surveyor. And when he threatened to expose my business arrangements to federal authorities, I eliminated the threat. The casual admission of murder was delivered without emotion, as if Victor were discussing the weather or the price of cattle. But there was something else in his manner, a need to justify his actions that suggested he wasn't as coldly rational as he pretended to be. "You see, Mrs. Hartwell, your husband suffered from the delusion that individual conscience matters more than social progress. He couldn't understand that the development of this territory requires practical men willing to make difficult decisions. The Indian children in my mines are providing valuable labor while learning civilized work habits. The profits from their efforts fund irrigation projects, railroad construction, and agricultural development that will benefit thousands of people." Victor moved closer as he spoke, his voice taking on the passionate intensity of a true believer explaining his faith. Arthur saw only individual suffering and missed the larger picture. A few dozen Indian children endure temporary hardship so that entire communities can prosper. The weak serve the strong as nature intended, and civilization advances through the will of superior men. Eleonora listened to his twisted philosophy with growing revulsion, but she also recognized the danger in his absolute certainty. Victor wasn't just a criminal, he was a fanatic who had convinced himself that his crimes were acts of heroism. "The children you torture aren't learning work habits," she said, her hand tightening on her gun. "They're being worked to death in illegal mines that violate federal treaties and territorial law. You're not a builder of civilization, you're a slaver and a murderer who hides behind fancy words and expensive clothes." Victor's expression darkened at her rejection of his philosophy, and for the first time, she saw the brutal reality beneath his cultured facade. Your husband said something similar just before I crushed his skull, he said softly. He called me a monster, as if moral judgments from inferior minds carried any weight. I explained to him, as I'm explaining to you, that progress requires sacrifice. Unfortunately, he was too limited to understand. The threat was unmistakable. But before Eleonora could respond, the sound of gunfire from the yard below drew Victor's attention to the window. The storm was reaching its peak, and lightning illuminated the chaos outside, where Wakiza's warriors were systematically destroying Victor's defenses. It appears your savage friends are providing quite a distraction, Victor observed with clinical detachment. No matter. My men have dealt with Indian raids before, and they'll deal with this one. The real question is what to do with you and that inconvenient evidence your husband collected. He moved toward a wall safe, hidden behind one of his paintings, but Eleonora was already drawing her revolver. Don't move another step. Victor paused, his hand inches from the safe's combination lock, and turned to face her with something approaching admiration. There's the killer instinct I was wondering about. You do have steel in your spine after all, Mrs. Hartwell. But can you actually pull that trigger when the moment comes? Try me, Eleonora replied, her gun trained on his chest. Instead of reaching for the safe, Victor suddenly lunged toward a rifle propped against the bookshelf. Eleonora fired, but her shot went wide as he dove behind the massive desk. The cattle baron came up with his rifle ready, and only her quick reflexes saved her as she rolled behind a leather chair just as his bullet shattered the window behind her. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse in the confines of the office, with both combatants using furniture and fixtures for cover while seeking clean shots at their opponent. Victor had the advantage of knowing the room's layout, but Eleonora had desperation and the moral certainty that came from fighting for justice rather than profit. You can't win this, you know, Victor called out during a brief lull in the shooting. Even if you kill me, my organization will survive. I've built something larger than any individual, a network of relationships and mutual obligations that transcends personal loyalty. Maybe, Eleonora replied, reloading her revolver behind the cover of an overturned bookshelf. But without you to hold it together, your empire will collapse like a house of cards. And every child you've enslaved will go home to their families. Victor's response was a barrage of rifle fire that splintered the furniture around her and filled the air with flying debris. But his shots were wild, driven by rage rather than tactical thinking, and Eleonora realized that his philosophical certainty was cracking under the pressure of actual resistance. The confrontation reached its climax when lightning struck the powder magazine outside, creating an explosion that shook the entire building and shattered every window in the office. In the chaos that followed, both combatants found themselves disoriented and half-deaf from the concussion. Eleonora recovered first, but as she emerged from her cover with her gun ready, she found Victor standing beside his safe with a derringer in his hand and Arthur's tin box tucked under his arm. "A checkmate, Mrs. Hartwell," he said with savage satisfaction. "You can shoot me, but not before I put a bullet through your heart. And when we're both dead, my men will burn this evidence and continue their work as if nothing had happened." That was when Wakiza appeared in the doorway behind Victor, silent as a ghost and deadly as winter. The Cheyenne warrior's knife took the cattle baron between the shoulder blades, sliding between ribs to find his heart with surgical precision. Victor Thorne died as he had lived, believing himself superior to the very end, never understanding that his victims were human beings rather than resources to be exploited. His last words were a curse directed at the savages who had dared to challenge white authority, revealing the racism and contempt that had motivated his crimes. As Eleonora retrieved Arthur's evidence from the dead man's grasp, she felt no satisfaction in Victor's death, only a weary relief that his reign of terror was finally ended. Justice had been served, but the cost in human suffering was almost too great to bear. The aftermath of the battle revealed both the scope of their victory and the price that had been paid for it. Victor Thorne lay dead in his office, his criminal empire shattered by the coordinated assault that had freed the kidnapped children and exposed his network of corruption to federal authorities. Sheriff Klaus Mueller arrived with the dawn, leading a posse of townspeople who had finally found courage to challenge Victor's authority. But Klaus's bluster seemed forced as he surveyed the scene of destruction, and his nervous glances toward the federal investigators who had accompanied him suggested that his own position was precarious. "No, this is quite a mess." Klaus declared, his German accent thicker than usual. "Federal marshals will want explanations about what happened here." Deputy Percy Morrison stepped forward with a telegram bearing official seals. Message came in on the Morning Wire, Sheriff. County Clerk Oscar Brennan has confessed to forging documents under duress from Victor Thorne. He's prepared to testify before federal authorities about the entire operation. The evidence was overwhelming. Oscar's confession, combined with Arthur's documentation and the testimony of the rescued children, created a case that would reshape territorial law enforcement and bring federal oversight to regions where corruption had flourished unchecked. Wakiza approached Eleonora, with his sons flanking him like young warriors learning proper conduct. Both boys bore the physical and emotional scars of their captivity, but they were alive and free, and gradually beginning to believe that their nightmare was truly over. "My sister Ayasha wishes to speak with you," Wakiza said quietly, gesturing toward where the Cheyenne woman waited with the other warriors. Ayasha proved to be a woman of intelligence and quiet dignity, who had clearly inherited the leadership qualities that made her brother such an effective war chief. When she spoke, her words carried the formal weight of tribal authority. "You have fought beside my people like a true warrior," Ayasha said in careful English. "Among the Cheyenne, such courage creates bonds that last beyond a single lifetime. You will always have friends among our nation." The formal adoption ceremony created connections that transcended the cultural boundaries that had seemed so important before their shared ordeal. Eleonora had begun this journey seeking personal revenge, but she was ending it as part of a larger community, bound together by mutual respect and common purpose. Edwin Pike's role in their victory was complicated by his earlier betrayal, but his willingness to risk his life for redemption had earned him a measure of forgiveness. The doctor's wound was serious, but not fatal, and his testimony about Victor's threats would be crucial for federal prosecutors building their case against the remaining members of the criminal organization. "I know I can never fully atone for my cowardice," Edwin said, as federal marshals prepared to escort him to Copper Gulch for medical treatment and debriefing. "But perhaps exposing the truth about Arthur's murder will be a start." The liberation of Victor's mining operation freed 17 children who had been given up for dead by their families. The reunion scenes that followed were both heartbreaking and healing, as parents who had mourned their children discovered that hope and determination could overcome even the most systematic cruelty. Greasy Pete Sullivan had vanished during the final assault, escaping into the wilderness with a handful of Victor's most loyal gunmen. Federal marshals would pursue them with warrants and bounties, but men like Pete had learned to survive in country where law enforcement was scattered and communication was slow. He would remain a threat until he was captured or killed, but his power to terrorize entire communities was broken. 3 months later, the federal courthouse in Copper Gulch buzzed with the controlled energy of justice finally being served. Judge Harrison Whitmore, whose reputation for integrity had survived decades of frontier politics, reviewed the evidence with the careful attention of a man who understood that his decisions would determine the future of territorial law enforcement. The trial itself was less a legal proceeding than a public revelation of systematic corruption that had infected every level of territorial government. Oscar Brennan's testimony about forged documents was corroborated by Edwin Pike's medical evidence and supported by the physical proof that Arthur Hartwell had died protecting. When the verdicts were finally read, they represented more than individual justice. They were a declaration that federal law would not tolerate the kind of systematic exploitation that had made Victor Thorne's empire possible. The remaining members of his organization received sentences ranging from lengthy prison terms to execution, while corrupt officials found their careers and reputations destroyed by association with crimes that could no longer be hidden. Eleonora stood on the courthouse steps beside Wakiza, and his sons watching the afternoon sun paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. The tin box that had contained Arthur's evidence now rested in federal custody, its contents having served their purpose in bringing justice to those who had believed themselves above territorial law. "What happens now?" Talon asked his father, the boy's voice, carrying curiosity mixed with the wariness that would take time to fade. "Now we rebuild." Wakiza replied simply, "We take broken things and make them whole again." But Eleonora found herself wondering what home meant for a widow whose husband's murder had been avenged and whose property rights had been restored by federal decree. The Hartwell Ranch waited for her return, but it would be empty without Arthur's presence to give it meaning and purpose. As if reading her thoughts, Wakiza turned to study her with the same careful attention he had shown when evaluating weather signs or reading enemy intentions. "White woman has strong medicine," he said quietly. "Strong enough to heal wounded land and broken people." The offer implicit in his words was both practical and profound. A partnership based on mutual respect rather than romantic sentiment, combining her legal ownership of the water rights with his knowledge of the country and his son's need for stability as they recovered from their ordeal. "My ranch has good water and sufficient grazing," she replied carefully, understanding the deeper meaning of their conversation. "There's work available for men who understand the country and can be trusted with difficult responsibilities." Practical arrangement. Wakiza agreed. White woman provides land and legal protection. Cheyenne warrior provides security and knowledge of old ways. Children learn from both traditions while growing strong. It was Edwin Pike who provided the final piece of their puzzle. Despite his wound and his complicated relationship with the events that had brought them together, the doctor had been thinking about the future of Willow Springs and the communities that would grow around Eleonora's water rights. "Arthur left more than just legal documents," Edwin said, as they prepared to board the train that would carry them home. "He left detailed surveys of the entire watershed, including sources that Victor never knew existed. With proper development, this could support agricultural communities throughout the territory." Eleonora opened the locket that had belonged to her husband, revealing the carefully folded survey map that represented Arthur's final gift to the future he had died trying to protect. The document showed not one, but 3 reliable water sources on the Hartwell property, positioned to support irrigation systems that could transform thousands of acres of marginal land into productive farms. Enough water for many families," Wakiza observed, studying the hidden map with growing understanding. "Enough to build something lasting." As their train pulled away from Copper Gulch toward the sunset-painted peaks of home, Eleonora sat beside Wakiza, while Talon and Yazi pressed their faces to the windows, watching familiar landscape roll past with wonder of children rediscovering a world they had thought lost forever. The evidence that had brought justice to Victor Thorne and his associates was now part of federal records. But the real work of building something better from the ashes of corruption was just beginning. The partnership between a widowed surveyor's wife and a Cheyenne warrior, seeking his stolen children, had evolved into something larger, a foundation for communities based on cooperation rather than exploitation. Years later, when historians studied the transformation of territorial law enforcement and the peaceful integration of Indian and white communities in the region around Willow Springs, they would point to the unusual partnership between Eleonora Hartwell and Wakiza as a model for what could be accomplished when people of different backgrounds found common ground in their commitment to justice and human dignity. The tin box that had started it all eventually found its way to the Smithsonian Institution, where it became part of an exhibit on territorial corruption and federal efforts to combat it. Visitors could read Arthur's original documents, examine the evidence that had brought down Victor Thorne's criminal empire, and learn about the unlikely alliance that had made such justice possible. But the real legacy lived on in the communities that grew around the water sources Arthur had died to protect, where children grew up, learning both Cheyenne wisdom and white technology, where differences in language and custom were bridges rather than barriers, and where the memory of Arthur Hartwell's courage inspired new generations to believe that individual actions could change the world. Eleonora and Wakiza never married in any ceremony that white or Cheyenne law would recognize. But they built a life together that honored both their traditions while creating something uniquely their own. Their partnership became the foundation for agricultural development that transformed the entire region, proving that cooperation could accomplish more than conflict ever would. The Hartwell Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, becoming a model for peaceful coexistence between peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies. The water that Arthur had fought to protect flowed through channels that Wakiza's engineering knowledge had improved, irrigating fields that fed both communities and creating prosperity based on honest labor rather than exploitation. When federal investigators came to study the success of Willow Springs as an example of racial cooperation, they found detailed records of every decision, every crop, and every child educated in the settlement's integrated school. But they could never fully understand some of the deeper currents that had made such success possible, the bonds forged through shared danger, the trust built through mutual sacrifice, and the simple recognition that justice was worth any price required to achieve it. The children who had been rescued from Victor's mines grew up to become teachers, farmers, craftsmen, and leaders in their communities. They carried with them not just the scars of their captivity, but also the knowledge that evil could be defeated when people of goodwill stood together against it. Their success became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of communities built on justice rather than fear. As the sun set behind the mountains of Raven's Nest for the final time in this story, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that promised fair weather for the work ahead, Eleonora could look back on a life transformed by tragedy into something larger and more meaningful than she had ever imagined possible. Arthur's death had been avenged, but more importantly, his vision of a just society had been realized through the partnership that grew from his widow's determination and a Cheyenne warrior's love for his children. The tin box was empty now, its contents having served their purpose in the pursuit of justice. But the legacy of what it had contained would live on in the communities it had helped to create, the children it had helped to save, and the partnerships it had helped to forge between people who had learned to see past their differences to the common humanity that united them all.